right, so this morning, and sorry for those of you that I didn't wait on, I got a little impatient. I know that, I guess Dale went a little long here in the
Well, Scotty
service.
Scarborough went forward.
There were several things.
Yeah.
Still wills and kind of saying goodbye to them.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't know who was here and who wasn't here, so I just went ahead and we got ourselves started this morning. And we'll announce again that Melody will not be here next week. And so we need someone to run the recorder next week.
And I have a sheet that has the instructions on it, but I'll leave with it, okay?
And we do want to welcome those of you that are always on with us virtually. I'm sorry that I have a tendency to just talk past the camera, but we are glad that you're here with us this morning. Also, I mentioned before class started that I will not be here next week. And so if anyone is willing and able to teach, I'll get with you and pass on the chapter of the book. If you'll catch me after class. If not, I'll get with Dewey and we'll figure out what we need to do for next week. So my wife and I are going to be traveling, so we'll not be here. So let's get started this morning because it's I usually do the majority of my prep work on Saturdays, and I try to read the story during the week and kind of start thinking about it and looking at it. And I got to going yesterday, and we're going to be going to 2 Samuel this morning. And I'll give you more specific verses here in a few minutes. But as I started studying this lesson, it took me several hours because I ended up reading all of 2 Samuel and then going in and reading some of the Kings and just trying to refresh myself on the background of the story. And so there's a lot to cover, and I usually get about halfway through a lesson anyway. So we're going to try to get started this morning. So let's set the scene for today's lesson, because again, we've talked about these are all standalone lessons. And so today's lesson is going to be set in the time period where David is dealing with Absalom. Does anybody remember the story of David and Absalom?
Absalom was his son,
Yes.
and he made war against his father,
Yes.
and I believe David killed him.
Oh, he does get killed.
But he wasn't David, okay?
That's correct. It was not
He
David.
has the long hair.
Yeah.
He's the one that got caught in the tree and
Oh, okay.
his horse ran out, or his mule ran out from under him. And then his enemies came and killed him while he was hanging in the tree.
Wasn't it Joab?
It was Joab.
Yeah.
It was David given specific orders not to do this. And yet Joab found out that he was hanging in the tree and went over and ran a spear through him and then had all of his men, it says, fall on him and kind of finish the job.
Wasn't Joab leader of his army?
Joab was the leader of David's army. And that's, in the story, it talks about Joab feeling like this is what needed to be done to protect David, basically, is the gist you get. So you've got all of that. And if you go back a little bit further into 2 Samuel, you get into the story of David and Bathsheba. And that plays into today's story as well. Somebody just give me a quick background on Bathsheba and David. And we don't have to have the beginning of it, but what happens during the middle and the end of the Bathsheba story? We know that he sees her on the roof, and then what happens after that?
Well, he has her husband killed, and he ends up marrying her.
Okay.
And she's pregnant, and they lose the baby. And
No, you're good. Yeah,
And
she ends up pregnant. They have a baby. The baby dies after birth, and
then he wrote Psalm 51.
then he wrote Psalm 51. But what does anybody? Well, actually, let's just go there right now. 2 Samuel 12. 2 Samuel 12. There's only one Samuel. 2 books. And verses 10 through 12. If someone wouldn't mind reading that for me. 2 Samuel 12, verses 10 through 12.
Now therefore the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household, I'm going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel.
All right. So right here, Nathan is passing on a judgment that God has put in place for David because of his actions with Bathsheba and her husband Uriah, and the killing of her husband, the taking of her, the lusting after her, the whole sordid story. Nathan comes to him, and if you remember this, Nathan said, he tells him this story about this man who had all these cattle, and he had all these, I think it was a sheep that they're talking about, it's a flock, and then there's this other man who has only one, and he loves that one with everything he has, but the man who has many goes and takes the sheep from the one that has one. And anyway, there's this whole story, and David gets enraged and says, who is this man? He has to be punished. And Nathan says, it's you. You're the one that did this. And then he goes ahead and tells him what God has said, because you did it, and here's what's going to happen. And that's what we just read. And so that's the beginning of this story, because that leads into Absalom, doesn't it? How does that punishment that Nathan proclaimed on David manifest itself? How does it come about? What's the story that is some of that punishment? And we've already mentioned it, so.
Think that his son turned against him.
Absolutely. It's Absalom, isn't it? Now, it's not just Absalom, because before Absalom turns against him, he also has, I cannot remember the son's name, that rapes Tamar, his sister. Amnon, yeah. And so you've got the whole story of, you can just see his offspring starting to fall apart. And you get the brother that rapes the sister, so Absalom kills the brother, and you just got this whole chaos and turmoil in David's family. And there are times we wonder, what have we done in our lives to cause this to happen? David didn't have to wonder, did he? This was a straight judgment from God. He was told, this is going to happen to you. Your family will always live and die by the sword because of the things that you have done. And so this story is where Absalom has come in. And I didn't realize, when you go back and you read the story, Absalom, of course, kills his brother and then flees. And then at some point, David brings him back to the court. And then it says for 40 years, and I didn't realize the time there that Absalom spent at the gate of the city, and he just intercepted people that were coming to talk to the king. He would intercept them and say, what is your purpose here in Jerusalem? And they would tell him, and he'd go, well, there's nobody here to hear your case, so why don't you let me hear it? I'm the son of the king, and I'll help you take care of this. And so over 40 years, he created this wide range of support from everybody that's coming in from all over the kingdom. So that when he was ready to rebel, he was popular, wasn't he? He was as popular almost as David was, because all these people had come in and he had done favors for them. And he had made that work. I can't, let's see, I think that is maybe
15.
Is it chapter 15?
Absalom's conspiracy.
Yeah, that's it. In verse 7, it says, now it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said to the king, that's that 40 years while he was sitting there, basically preparing himself for this rebellion. And so I didn't realize how much time it was. I thought this was a 4 or 5 year type period. This is a long period that got set up, and some of this turmoil was happening. So anyway, David now, our story today is going to take place in chapter 16. And David is fleeing from Jerusalem because at this time, Absalom has gone out and gathered his support, and he's building basically an army to come, and that he's going to overthrow his father's kingdom. And so the people that are loyal to David have come and told him, hey, we're in a bind. You're fixing to be over. You need to flee from the city right now. And so David gathers all of his things, all of his people, and they head out. They're leaving the city. And so in chapter 16, we've already talked a little bit about how David deals with people. And if you remember, the title of this book does anybody remember the title of the book? Yeah, Good Lessons from Bad People. That's right. Good Lessons from Bad People. And so today, David gets to deal with another bad person. And we're going to be in chapter 16, and it is verses 5 through 14. If anybody wouldn't mind reading that, this is the main part of our story today.
What's chapter?
Chapter 16, 5 through 14.
I'll get it.
All right.
Through 14. Okay. When King David came to her, and there came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. And as he came, he cursed continually. And he threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David and all the people. And all the mighty men were on his right hand, his left hand. And Shimei said as he cursed, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged you, or avenged on you all blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood. Then Abishai, the son of Zerah, said to the king, why should this king, this dead dog, curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head. But the king said, what have I to do with you, you son of Zerah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, curse David, who then shall say, why have you done so? And David said to Abishai and to his servants, behold, my own son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamin leave him alone, let him curse, for the Lord has told him to do it may be that Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today. So David and his men went on the road while Shimei went along to the hillside opposite him, and cursed as he went and threw stones at him, flung dust. And the king of people who were with him arrived weary at the Jordan, and there he refreshed himself.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So you have this character. This is the bad person in the story, of course. I guess if they make a movie, he's probably been portrayed not real well. And so what happens is David and his entourage are leaving the city, and they come into this kind of valley type area, and there's a man that's standing up over here on an embankment, and he is just doing what?
Swearing.
He is cursing, throwing rocks, throwing sand. It sounds like he's a little bit of a madman, and you know, it's can we relate to that in today's political world? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
that's what I was thinking. So, you know, this is 2,000, 3,000, you know, with David 3,000 years ago. This is not anything new in our world. Politics, huh? People get over on the side, and this guy is brave. He's not even on social internet. You know, he is. I mean, he's not on the social media. He is in person, and he's going to let the king have it as he goes down the road. And so, as Shimei, I looked it up in some YouTube to see how to pronounce his name. And I'm sorry, I gave you a reading full of names, and those are always fun to have to do. So Shimei is up there, and he's letting him have it. And so, sure enough, one of David's men, which is exactly how you think it should be. I mean, these are David's most trusted people. They know David's hurting right now. David is in a dangerous position. And you got this guy up there that's pretty easy to take care of. All I got to do is go up there, and Abishai comes over and says, what? Let me go do what? Let me cut off his head. That'll stop the talk. Okay? So he's going to go over and do that. And And then, of course, David gives him the hey, no, we're not going to do that. And so this man is allowed to continue to curse and taunt and throw rocks and throw sand and dirt and just to be a general annoyance for the whole time. And it says, I think verse 14 it's somewhat amusing because it says by the time they ended, they were all what? They were exhausted. They were weary. And you have to know they're already high emotions because they're this is an escape. This is not just, hey, the king's going down the road for a picnic. This is an escape. So they don't know at what minute they may have an army fall on them, ambush them. They're on high alert. And so they're already tension is high. And as they're going down this road, now there's this guy up there that is just a constant. It says all day as they walk, this guy was cursing and yelling and screaming. And you can't hit the mute button. It's just there. And so I thought that's interesting, that verse 14, just that they were exhausted. And y'all understand that. You can understand that. Most of us have had days, probably not like that, but most of us have had days where it's not a good day to start with. And for whatever reason, this is the day somebody picks to just make your life miserable. And I promise you as a coach, I've seen that. Because I'm telling you right now, a 6.5-hour doubleheader on a Saturday when you're not very good and you're getting beat real bad and that dad over there will not leave you alone. I feel like, and that's just part of what David's gone through. So, we've all had those kind of deals. So who does this passage tell us that Shimei was related to? It starts off by telling us who he was related to.
Saul family.
He was related to Saul. Okay, and so as he comes out, the majority of these curses that he's throwing on David have to do with what?
Saul.
With Saul and their family. So what are his accusations that he starts tossing out there? Look through the verses there and see what are.
David's a murderer.
That he's a murderer, that he's guilty of bloodshed. And really, when you look at that, it's true. David has killed a lot of people, hasn't he? Do you think that Shimei was referring to Uriah, or who do you think Shimei was referring to, that he would be a man of blood, man of bloodshed? Since we know he's from Saul's house.
I think that she was.
Okay, he could be talking about Uriah.
But he also killed his tens of thousands.
He's killed, yeah. I mean, we know the song says, Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Who else do you think specifically maybe Shimei is holding him accountable for?
The death of Saul.
The death of Saul and Jonathan, even though Jonathan was David's best friend, right? They died side by side. And if you go back and read the story, that's what I'm talking about. I had to keep going back and reading stories and finding out. Where was David when Jonathan and Saul were killed? Does anyone remember who he was living with?
The Philistines, wasn't
The Philistines. So if you go back and do the backstory, the Philistines are the ones that killed Saul and Jonathan. Now, David was not fighting with them. David was not out in open rebellion. And as a matter of fact, if we go back to some of the stories we've already covered, how did David feel about the office of the king, if that's the term you want to use?
He honored it.
He honored it. He held it in so much respect that he was not going to touch the chosen one of God, because he had his chances to avenge himself on Saul. So we've read some of those stories. So we know he held and I'm just using the word office, of king, being the chosen one of God in such high esteem. He was not going to harm one hair on Saul's head. So we know he didn't rebel and fight, but at the same time, people know that he was basically in political exile and he was living in the Philistine lands when the Philistine army attacked and killed David and killed Saul and Jonathan. So that could have been part of it. There's a story about Ishbosheth, which was one of Saul's sons, that after Saul's death, and I think it was Joab again, but I may be wrong, because after reading all these things and all these, this is really a political thriller. If you read this book, we're reading all these stories together, it's a little bit of a political thriller, because Ishbosheth was still alive after David and Jonathan were killed, and now David is supposed to ascend to the throne, and all of a sudden 2 men in his sleep go in and kill the king's son, Ishbosheth. And even though no story ties David to it, conspiracy theories are not new today either, are they? And so, you know, it makes a great story to say that David now knows he's going to get to be king, but he's got to make sure that the lineage of Saul is killed off. Which we know that's not true, because what does he do for Jonathan's son? Does anybody remember? Starts with an L.
Mephibosheth.
Yeah, Mephibosheth.
Yeah.
I love these Jewish names. So we know that he takes Jonathan's crippled son and lets him live in his court and takes care of him and raises him. Well, not raises him, but takes him as one of his own. And so we know that he's not trying to kill off the lineage of Saul. But that's also could be a possible story. And then the one that I think is less likely, but towards the end of 2 Samuel, you have a story. When you get to the end of 2 Samuel, it's like there's just some 3 or 4 random stories kind of tossed in about David as king. And there's a lot of people that feel like maybe some of these stories occurred maybe before, like they're not in their correct timeline in the book. And there's a story of a group called the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites had been severely mistreated by Saul through his years of being king, even though Saul had set up a treaty with the Gibeonites. And so when Saul dies and David becomes king, the Gibeonites come to David and demand justice for the wrongs that have been done. Does anybody remember what David did? Let's see where I can find that. It's in chapter 21, but he avenges the Gibeonites by turning over 7 sons of Saul. So he gives, and I don't know if they're actually his sons or if they're just males in the household of Saul, but he turns over 7 people to the Gibeonites and they hang them all and kill them. That's their revenge for what had happened to their people from Saul or by Saul. So as you look out there, we're not exactly sure which of these Shimei is talking about, but it could be any of them. It could be Uriah, it could be Saul and Jonathan, it could be Ishbosheth, it could be the sons of Saul that were given to the Gibeonites. There's a lot of opportunity. And then we also talked about the fact that David's a warrior. He has killed or been responsible for many men dying. So he is, this accusation has some truth to it and some exaggeration, hyperbole, whatever term you want to use. There's little truth. And this is what happens so often, isn't it, in politics and in arguments, is you get a little bit of the story, you get a political side, people pick sides. So anyway, he's up there and he's yelling these things at David. What's his second accusation? It says that he is what? He's a scoundrel. And I found this to be the word worthless. In some versions, it's my version says that you're a rogue. And then the book talks about a kind of a fringe version that even says you're a son of hell. And so, in other words, whatever he is, he's evil. And so that's the word or the terms that he's tossing out there. So why do you think Shimei was doing this? And there's a couple of different reasons, options, and they may all be true. Why was he doing this?
Just to make David look bad in front of the people that did have faith in him.
Absolutely. This is if we go back, well, yeah, you're right. So he's up there and he is making David miserable. And if there are people that are in the group that are questioning, should I really be running with this guy or should I just hang around and let the next king do his thing? This has to be playing in their minds. We got this guy up there on this hill and he's screaming and he's making all these accusations. Bless you. He's making all these accusations and David's not even refuting the accusations. And he's certainly not taking care of it. He's got all these men that are, there's a bunch of men there that are willing to go cut this head off. And David's not letting them do it. So you're right. It helps cast doubt in his group. So it sows more discord in a group that's already in a bad way. What else? And along with that, let's go along with that. Shimei is watching a king do what? What are they doing?
Running away.
They're running, they're retreating. They're running away. Have you ever seen those people that are, boy, they're brave whenever somebody's running away, you got them beat.
Yeah.
As a coach, I've had these kids on my team that when we're up big, boy, they talk a good game and they want to chatter at their opponent, and I'm telling them, you better stop. Because that's, number one, it's unsportsmanlike, but number two, you're going to be on the other end of this one of these days. But these kids, they're front runners is what I call them. They're front runners. Boy, we're winning and I'm big and I'm bad and I'm going to tell you all about it. That's Shimei right here. You're running away. You're this bad. They're headed off. He's taunting a loser. And he feels pretty safe about it because what's happening in Jerusalem behind him? There's a new king coming in with a bigger army. So he's probably thinking, as David's headed off, you're gone. You're done, so I can make fun of you now, ha ha. And actually, he talks about the fact that, you came in and you're a man of bloodshed and you are the one who took down the house of Saul and you have now taken his place. And now God's given you yours. So he's really letting him have it. I call those guys front runners. He's standing up there and he's taunting a loser. That's what he's doing. What else? What does the Bible say? What do the verses tell us it may have been? David kind of alludes to it. It may have been God ordained. He says, if God tells this man to curse me, who am I to shut him up, right? And then he goes on to say what? If God ordained it, maybe what could come of it?
Good.
Yeah, there might be some good of this. Maybe this is God testing me. Maybe God is going to allow me to take this, and if I will take this with the right heart, then maybe in the end, God will bless me and see my affliction and bring good from it. And so I think it's really interesting because earlier, 2 lessons ago for us, we studied a man in 1 Samuel that taunted David, and what was about to happen to that man? Nabal. What was David's response to him? If you remember, Nabal sent his men back to say, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? And he taunted David. What did David say?
He was going to go kill him.
And who?
And every man.
Every male in his household. So we see maybe David has learned a lesson, hadn't he? David has learned a little bit about this idea of revenge. And if you remember the end of Nabal's story, David doesn't take revenge because Nabal's wife comes and pleads and begs him not to, and David listens to reason. David listens to some good advice. And in the end of that story, 10 days after Nabal taunts him, what happens to Nabal?
He dies.
God takes his life. Then it says specifically, God struck him down. God caused this to happen. So God avenged David's honor. God avenged, or was the one that was responsible for the revenge that occurred, not David. So hopefully, maybe, there's been a lot of years that have passed since Nabal, because Nabal was before David was king, and now we're talking about many years of being king. So I think it's interesting, though, and let's be honest, especially you guys. I don't know about ladies because y'all are always more rational than we are. But I know when I was 22, 23, 24, 25, and I was coaching, I was fiery. And if something happened, I was ready to fight. There were a couple of times I wanted to get out on the field, take helmets off the kids, and just go against the coach. That's just kind of how I felt that way. Well, I'm 50-something now, and I don't quite have that response anymore. What happens to us as we get older?
Hopefully we get wiser.
We get a little wiser. We have a tendency to mellow a little bit. I don't know. I watched my dad, and as he got really older, he kind of I don't know if we lose I care anymore. I don't care. I'm old enough now. I'm just going to do it. But, I think men have a tendency to mellow out, soften a little bit, but they gain wisdom. And I think we see this in David because he's much older now, and he's being taunted by a fool. And this is maybe a worse taunting than when Nabal did. Because Nabal just kept it between. He told his men, and then his men came and told David, and whoever was around for David to hear it. This is out in public. This is for everybody to see. And David's response is, maybe I need to take this. Maybe there's something I can learn from this. Maybe this is a message. I think that David has just come off of being chastised by Nathan for what happened with Uriah. He's been through all of this. He's seen his son rebel. He's seen his daughter be raped by his other son. He's seen the one son kill another. I mean, he's suffered a lot between Nabal and Shimei. And I think that, and again, this is just my opinion, I think that maybe that David has really learned his lesson, and that I think you can see it. Because what shows, I mean, how do you know what's on the inside of a person? By their actions. Not necessarily what they say, but by their actions. And in this case, instead of David turning and immediately telling Abishai, thank you, I was just waiting for one of you to tell me, don't cut that head off. He says, no, don't do this. And not only that, he tells Abishai, how long do I have to bear with you doing this to me? In other words, Abishai is tempting him too, because as a king, he knows he has that power. And Abishai is tossing it out there, hey, I'll do it. You don't have to, I'll do it. Apparently, David could have grabbed a sling and gotten him, I would think, after his stories from before, but he doesn't do that. He chooses to humble himself. He chooses to say, you know what, I'm going to let God do what God does. And I think I just think after looking at the ball, when we come over and we look at Shimei, that's just a fascinating thing that he would do that. Let's talk about, let's see, we talked about David's response. So Shimei, he does this thing, and David and his army head on down the road, and we don't hear from Shimei again for a while. We do hear from Shimei again. So let's look at what happens next. Let's turn to 2 Samuel 19. And I'll just read this. We're going to be in chapter 19, verses 16 through 23. Make sure I'm in the right place. All right, so David is returning to Jerusalem. This is after the end of Absalom. Absalom has been killed. He was hanging in a tree. The rebellion is over. David is going to return to the city of Jerusalem and retake his throne. So in verse 16, it says, and Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjamite, who was from Bahurim, hurried and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David. There were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons and his 20 servants were with him. And they went over the Jordan before the king. Then a ferry boat went across to carry over the king's household and do what he thought good. Where am I going to? 23. Now Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king when he had crossed the Jordan. And he said to the king, do not let my lord impute iniquity to me, or remember what went wrong, or what wrong your servant did on the day that my lord the king left Jerusalem, that the king should take it to heart. For I, your servant, know that I have sinned. Therefore here I am, the first to come today of all the house of Joseph, to go down to meet my lord the king. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, answered and said, shall not Shimei be put to death for this? Because he cursed the Lord's anointed. And David said, what have I to do with you, sons of Zeruiah, that you should be adversaries to me today? Shall any man be put to death today in Israel? For do I not know that today I am king over Israel? Therefore the king said to Shimei, you shall not die. And the king swore to him. So David is now coming back triumphant because and you know, when I say triumphant, do you remember the state of mind that David was in after Absalom was killed? Oh yeah, he mourned for Absalom. He mourned to the point that Joab had to go to him and say, hey, David, you're losing your people because you just lost. Lots of people died for you today. Lots of people died for you so that you could remain king. And yet you make it look as though you would rather Absalom have lived and all of your men had died. If you don't get out here and thank your men and speak to your men and be happy for the win, you're about to lose their support. And they will support somebody else because you are more upset about your son dying than you are about the men and the people who fought for you and the sacrifice they gave. So he has to be kind of chided to go out and enjoy the fact that he is now going to be king again. There's no longer a rebellion. There's no longer anybody contesting his authority to be king. So as he's coming back, he's already, this is not a true, like you would see in the movies where the king returns and there's a parade and there's horns being blown and, they're traveling, and I get the sense that there's some celebration about it. Obviously, the army has won, that is coming back. So those men and those people are going to be happy. But King David himself is really stuck because he's He's mourning the loss of this son who he hated the fact that he had rebelled to start with. And he knows whose fault is all of that. His own. So David is torn. And so he's coming back, and who's the first person to meet him when he crosses the Jordan? Or before he crosses the Jordan, actually, Shimei came across to meet him. And so I thought that was fascinating. What does this tell us about Shimei? Again, this could be several things. What does it tell us about him?
He's a front runner.
He's a front runner. Okay, he's still a front runner. Hey, now that you're back, I'm on your side. Please don't cut my head off.
But Abishai is that young coach who wants to go fight. That's Abishai.
And again, I think it's interesting that Abishai didn't forget either, did he? It wasn't just David that knows. Everybody knows who this guy is. And Abishai says, are we going to let this guy live? Seriously? And if you look back in Exodus, I think it's chapter 22, I've got it on my notes, I think it's verse 28. It's in the old law, it actually says, if you curse God or his anointed one, that you are committing a sin. Now, it doesn't spell out the punishment, but we can tell by what's said that it sounds like maybe the tradition is if you curse the king, you die. And so this seems to be like Abishai saying, let me carry out the law. Don't let this man go unpunished. And yet David has the wisdom and the intelligence and the patience and the foresight and all those things that have come with years of ruling. And he says what?
What business is it of yours, Abishai?
Say it again.
What business is it of yours, Abishai?
Yeah, he says, Abishai. And again, he tells him, stop doing this. Why are you trying to be an Abishai today? Hey, I'm king again. This is a happy day. Nobody's going to die because of me today. We've had enough death, enough killing. And he basically forgives Shimei. And I think it's interesting because I'm wondering if David still thinks back and wonders, man, this guy may have been doing it because God told him to do it. And so if God told him to do that, who am I, again, to take out revenge? I'll leave the revenge, I will leave the justice to God. And I think that, that we learn a lot from David in this story. Now, we're about out of time, so I'm going to skip reading the end. But David doesn't forget this. Does anybody know the true ending to this story? So on David's deathbed, he's talking to his son Solomon, who is going to take over the throne. And he says, hey, Solomon, there's a few things I need you to finish for me. And one of them is, don't forget this guy Shimei that still lives among us. I promised that I wouldn't kill him, but you know what to do. So that happens. David didn't completely forget about this. And so when Solomon becomes king, Solomon begins carrying out some of these last wishes of David. And Solomon is not going to go against the Lord's will. If the Lord wanted this guy to do what he did, and David spared him because the Lord allowed, he's not going to. Solomon, of course, is known for what? Wisdom. So Solomon says, Shimei, because of what you did to my father, here's your punishment. You're going to live over here, build you a house. We'll keep you, we'll give you your money. We'll take care of you. But the minute you step off this land, you cross the Jordan, or the Kidron River, as soon as you step across that river, you cost yourself your life. And so Shimei goes, okay, thank you. And he builds his house and he lives this little. Well, Shimei forgets. Shimei has a couple of slaves that run away. And somebody finds him and sends word that I've got your slaves. So Shimei and a couple of men go to pick up his slaves. And as soon as he steps across the river, what does Solomon do? Solomon brings him in and he says, hey, you agreed to this. You said this is a good thing. I will stay here and I will do what you tell me to do. And you crossed the river, so guess what's about to happen? Because of the sin you committed. And Solomon takes his life right there. He has one of his men kill him. So, the story still comes back to a lot of different things that we can learn from Shimei. I don't know. There's a lot of things you learn from Shimei. There's a lot of things you learn from David. But I think it's a fascinating story about what God's will may be, what we may have to suffer through. There's some lessons in forgiveness. There's some lessons in, I think Shimei was a bit of I don't know what term he's a little bit of a squirrel, isn't he? Because he did his thing, and then he came back and begged for his life. He got his life back. And then, I think Shimei is some of those people that think, nobody can do anything about me. I can do what I want to, and nobody's going to touch me because look what has happened. And in the end of this whole story, God's the one that's in control. God's the one that's going to have, God's will is what's going to be done. And I think that's a fascinating part of the story. So that's our good lesson from a bad guy today. And I know we got started a little bit late, but it's 10:20, and I hope everyone has a great week. I've got